Right, well, good evening everyone, and welcome to a nice and cool Qubit Theatre. And I hope those of you who are watching live online have found somewhere equally cool to sit and enjoy this evening's talk. This is our last talk before the summer break, and I think we're finishing on a subject that's going to stir the hearts of all true London Underground enthusiasts, the history of Metropolitan line locomotives, and in particularly focusing on Sarah Siddons. But before we start, as usual, there are just a few notices this time. You'll be pleased to know slightly less than usual. As always, if the fire alarm goes off, please leave the building as quickly as you can by the fire escape at the back, the fire escape there, and follow the instructions of the museum staff. Can you also please just take a few minutes, if you haven't done so, to check your phones are on silent? Thank you. Okay, now just a couple of items. For those of you who may not have picked it up, there is no special Friends Event sale this coming Thursday before the depot open weekend. The sales team have been exceptionally busy. At the weekend they were at the 38 running event at Acton. I think they took nearly £2,500 selling stuff, so they thought they needed a little bit of a break before they go at it on Friday. So for just this one occasion, there isn't a Friends afternoon. Our next event is on the 29th of June, and unfortunately we've had to change the speaker. Roy Watts isn't available any longer, but our sales manager John King has stepped up, and he will be giving a talk on the 125-year history of Waterloo Station. Now, if you've booked for the Roy Watts tour and want to come to John's talk, you don't have to rebook. We'll just assume that you're coming. And that'll be at 2 o'clock in the newly refurbished Holden Room down at Acton Depot. Then after the summer break, we start off here again at 6:15 on Monday the 11th of September, when Siddy Holloway will be talking about her hidden London experiences. And full details, as always, of all our future events will be in the magazine and on the e-newses that come out from time to time. So tonight, I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers, Charles Horsey and Graham Neal, who between them have over 95 years service with London Underground. So there's not much that they don't know about things. And also I have to say they're remarkably sane for someone who's done all that time with the Underground. Charles is the junior person with 45 years, all in engineering, and he was telling me he's done an awful lot of roles. He's been an engineer, he's been a project manager, he's been a planner, he's been in fund line operations, and is still with TfL Engineering. And he will cover the history of Sarah and other locomotives before handing over to our second speaker, Graham Neal. Graham is currently head of heritage operations here at the museum, but before, I suppose I call it retiring to take up yet another job, he spent 50 years at the Underground, starting as an apprentice electrician and rising to be professional head of vehicles. And Graham will cover the current state of repairs to Sarah, because as you know, she's 100 years old this year, and there's still, fingers crossed, the chance we might be able to get her into service. So can we please give a warm welcome to Charles and Graham.
Well, good evening to you all, and my thanks to the museum friends for inviting me to help out with this event tonight. And the first thing I need to do is set the scene, and if you like, prove the need. And this session, this talk is happening because there's a 100-year centenary. Back in the spring of 1923, all the 20 of the Metropolitan Vickers electric locomotives have been delivered. Were being commissioned and beginning a long service career, and 2 of those locomotives are still amongst us. And first we've got to highlight the working icon of our transport heritage, and that's Loco 12, Sarah Siddons. And one of my expert colleagues in LT has encapsulated Sarah as, and I have to read this here, the oldest standard gauge mainline electric loco that's still in continual use and not preserved in Britain and possibly in the world. So Sarah has a place in history for sure. There is also the second survivor. That's Loco 5 John Hampden, also past the 100-year mark, and he's actually slightly older than Sarah. He's now based at this location and still providing a service to London. Alongside these two locomotives, we have to think about the entire collective and come up with some additional credits for those that did their bit in service and through redeployment found further activities even after the passenger service work ended. If we add up all the time these locomotives have spent in their various roles, we come up with something like 875 years. So that's it's a good old time. It's fair to say that this collective of locomotives had mostly uneventful lives, fairly stable service lives, by and large performing consistently throughout. And the moments in the spotlight are pretty rare. But it's the daily work that made them special, in my view, and that gained them a following far and wide, and for all sorts of different reasons. For example, the model makers saw the special something in the locomotives and had to go at capturing the unique style and that's a sort of very enigmatic and likeable face on the end of those locos. They had to go, and there's 4 good examples where manufacturers have come up with something that actually captures the loco quite well. There's two ready-to-runs, a very hefty scratch build and a kit all in there. Nice work. Now, the locomotive hauled trains on the Met were a very distinctive part of the customer experience, and quite early on in their lives, the locomotives became a kind of face for the Metroland brand. Top left there, 1920s, Loco 17, captured in artwork but based on a photograph. But even back in just a year or two ago, another mural appeared in Metroland, or sort of Metroland, and the icon is still there. It has some kind of lasting cachet, if you like, and so we've got to credit these locomotives with being brand ambassadors, if you like. So there's character, consistency of performance, there's long service, all good reasons to celebrate this centenary, this breed. I just add that it shouldn't be all about the locomotives. We do have to recognise that many people got together to make these locomotives happen, to run them, to maintain them, keep them working, and even just simply take an interest in them from afar, from an enthusiast perspective as well as the travelling public. So we've got to acknowledge and celebrate all the people that played a role in getting the locomotives to where they got to. Now, we do have a few practicalities that I better squeeze in. I should say, first up, a form of credit. Most of the story that I'm going to cover tonight is actually already published. Many of you will be familiar with it. There's Ken Bennis' book from the 1960s. That's been enhanced, brought up to date in the 1980s with the Underground Railway Society and tons of good work from Bob Greenaway. So there's a plentiful source of history. And in that second edition, the preface said the subject was far from closed. Absolutely right, we're 40 years on from that book. And Sarah has a continuing working life. And in addition, the museums and archives have become that much more accessible. It's been possible to study some parts of the loco history in greater depth than before and maybe come up with some different interpretations of the story. I've got to credit the National Archives and the London Metropolitan Archives and Cumbria Archives and the LTM Museum, who've all made original sources available, which have helped my small chunk of the study. The other helpers, Cumbrian Railway Society, I must mention, and the London North Western Railway Society. Images for tonight and for the work I've done come from the Underground Society and Brian Hardy and Chris Westcott. And Brian Hardy's excellent analyses of schedules have been incredibly helpful as well. Just a couple more names in credits, and that's Gordon Cackett and Ken de Groom, both of whom have some kind of special talents, some skills, knowledge and experience that's quite relevant to this topic. And probably without them, I might not even got to the stage of publishing what I'd done. So credit to them too. The scope for tonight, which is kind of timeline across the page, down the diagonal, we do have to go back a little bit into the history to set the foundations for where we're going. There's a bit of a bulky chunk on the Reconstruction, which again explains why things are like they are. There is the main core of service life there, 1923 to 1961. And then there's a chunk of what happened afterwards with some various activities going on there. So those are the chunks that I'll work through. And at the bottom right, my colleague will slide sweetly to conclude the story. Some really good stuff. So, as I said, we need to go a little back into history. Not too far, but back to the Metropolitan being electrified in the early years of the 20th century. It's a good thing. It gives you capacity benefits, journey speed, and there's this journey quality thing. You get rid of the steam effects, the smoke from the subsurface railway. So electrification is a good thing. And at that time, you have to think about several corridors, several patterns of service. The Circle and Hammersmith and City. There's the inner area services, the Met, heading out towards Harrow and Uxbridge and so on. And then the longer distance Met trains, Cheshire Mailsbury and Verney Junction, and the Great Western passenger service into the city. Now it's those two latter service corridors, if you like, where the locomotives were really aimed at providing their value. In practice, the inner area services had a bit of help from the locos at odd times during the early years as well. And those two images show perhaps something of the core work of the electric locomotives on the mainline services. We've got compartment stock trains there of various generations, the two different types of early locomotive. Upper one's probably somewhere Kilburn territory, lower one, Neasden. So we're talking about services with customers travelling quite a long distance. They want comfort. You've got fairly hefty trains to haul around, but the services are quite irregular. They're not really that regular standard service pattern that we'd expect today, because the traffic demand was heftily in the peaks, not so much in the off-peaks, and of course the area was nowhere near as built up as it is today. So back in the early 1900s, let's say 1908, 5 of those trains would be in circulation, worst case, maximum. Just 5 trains. And the fleet of locomotives catered for that, that service operation. So that seems a bit quiet, but so in historical context, that's where it started. I should say, just slipping up the timelines a bit, 1919, you'd be having about something like 8 trains, similar to those, perhaps a little bit more modernised in the case of the lower one, but about 8 trains will be in circulation. So not a lot of trains out there doing the work, but gradually building up the traffic and the demand. We should say, of course, that it's the locomotives we're here for, and so each of those locomotives would have had a crew of 2, a driver and a driver assistant or assistant guard, whichever you like to term them. Each locomotive would have allocated to it 2 crews, and they shared the work between them around the working cycle. As well as the locomotives on the trains, there will be spare locos at the termini, at the changeover points as well, because we're dealing with locomotives that took trains to the electric boundary where steam locomotives took over. So enough locomotives for the trains that are swirling around, and a couple of spares at the end and the crews with them. Terminus layouts designed fairly neatly to give a swift changeover, and by and large changeovers tend to be scheduled around the 3-minute mark, so that's a pretty swift, pretty good way of changing over. And to put it in modern terminology, a changeover for a loco on one of these trains or a terminus, it's a bit like stepping back today in the modern railway world, with a slight difference that the crew steps back and brings their locomotive with them from one train to the following one. Now on to the Great Western passenger service to the city. Electric hauled from the beginning of 1907 into Aldgate and Liverpool Street, using a mixture of those termini. The balance between those two tended to change over the years, probably mostly going round at Liverpool Street, but not entirely. On a typical weekday, 4 locomotives would leave Neasden relatively early in the morning, sort of 6 a.m. mark. They would head to town. At Baker Street, 1 loco would cut off the formation, head to the city to become the extra spare, and the 3 would head off to Bishopsgate, Paddington, and pick up the trains as they came in. And then everything started to circulate after that. By about 1919, you talk about 7 trains every weekday coming in from the Great Western Outer Territory. Something like 4 or 5 in the morning, couple in the evenings. And you just get from those pictures a sense of the old Bishops Road station. Very different from the 1932 modernisation. And possibly down the bottom left, that pair of locomotives. Maybe they're lined up ready to do some work. Maybe they're lined up to go back. Sometimes at the end of the peak service, a pair might head back to Neasden, depending on which timetable was in operation. Sometimes a pair of them would lay over between the peaks on their own, no crew. But just to mention some of the other action, I'll start with the bottom left little list there. I mentioned those inner area workings. The Metropolitans seem perennially not to have the right stock at the right time. So as well as the multiple unit stock that they would conventionally have, they needed to keep people moving. It's quite heavy demand in those inner areas out to Harrow and so on. So early years, saloon stock trailers, and then rigid 8 wheel stock and Jubilee stock, then even later on the bogie stock or the GWR hired stock. All those trains at one time or other filled in for the passenger demand being loco hauled. Fitting in with a normal pattern into the terminus, change over, loco takes it away again. But with a stock that's perhaps not quite as sophisticated as some of the other traffic corridors. So plenty of action for the locomotives on those at various times in their early years. And up the top we see a fairly well-known picture and a fairly well-known activity. The Vine Street service was Goods Train 7, kicked in 1909 and pretty much stayed a similar pattern all the way to 1936, but 2 trips into town. Drop of the wagons early morning, and then the electric locomotive headed off to be a spare in the city. But very late in the evening, one of the locos off an incoming train to Baker Street trotted along to Farringdon and collected the wagons to take them back to Finchley Road Yard. I'll just slip in an aside, though it's not strictly pertinent to the story, that out of the 1919 timetables, there emerged that electric locos hold the milk trip, Neasden to Baker Street, dropping off milk at various intermediate locations. Just the loco and 2 milk vans, apparently. Doesn't appear in the timetables after then, but maybe the traffic was changing. So just a bit now, having set the scene with the sort of services that the locomotives would inherit. We talk about the original electric locomotives, a batch of 10 from 1904, 10 from 1906. The 1904 steeple cab or camelback, as you might describe them, the 1906 are box cab. Different traction manufacturers. What I've highlighted there is the facts that we do need to have for going into the rest of the story. We've got a length of the camelback loco 35 foot 9, BTH loco 33 foot 6 inches. So different lengths. Both locos, both types of locos, re-equipped by around 1913. So they've already put a lot of money into those locos, and they've re-equipped them for reliability, for availability, and because the pressures on their service are quite great, getting their performance up to scratch for the time. But there had been a Great War, and by 1919, the name of the game for the Met was recovering from that Great War. Assets were struggling a bit. Demand was very much greater than at the beginning of that war, and they assumed that there was going to be some continued growth. So they got in plans to upgrade the power supply, new steam locomotives, carriages and so on, new electric stock, improving some of the existing stock, and the Locomotive Reconstruction project. Support there from the board. Government, who controlled the purse strings in those years, says no. But the Met went ahead and sought the tenders for the rolling stock. This is where I slip in, again, a reference to the people. We've got up the top picture, Robert Hope Selby, General Manager, Board Member, and for the Loco project, he will be the project sponsor. Don't have a photograph for the next character. It's Willis Holt, the traffic manager. He'll be the senior user for the project. Doesn't appear a great deal in the paperwork, but what comes across is one of those real, practical, sensible, down-to-earth operators that's breed that recurs over the years and makes the Underground a lot of what it is today. And down the third character here, we've got Charles Jones, Chief Electrical and Mechanical Engineer. Now, he gets defined in the contract as the engineer. He's a kind of contract manager and a specifier, and accountable for those aspects of the project. He, no photograph, but he did, like Selby, got immortalised by a nameplate on a G-class steam loco. Now, there is one other character that I would assert plays a role in this story. Behind the curtain, maybe he had agendas of his own, maybe he was doing his own thing, but some of his actions led to things turning out the way they did. Now, so we look at that gentleman. Is he an actor, opera singer, sportsman? Well, he played a couple of first-class county games in the Victorian times. Some of you will recognise his surname, Docker. But that may be because of his son, who had a fairly high social profile in the 50s and 60s. But this is Frank Dudley Docker. He had a family firm producing paint and varnish, which he sold to the carriage manufacturers, among others. And in the end, he had a lot of business acumen. He was quite a sharp, if not a ruthless businessman. He took over a number of these railway, carriage and wagon companies and shook them down, streamlined them, and so on. Result was the Metropolitan Amalgamated Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, which became also a finance company by 1912. Mr. Docker collected director positions, certainly a director of the Metropolitan Railway, a few other industrial firms, and a director of the Midland Bank, which must have been kind of helpful. And he really aspired to set up a big industrial conglomerate in this country to rival some of the European competitors. Oh, and he also helped set up the CBI, or the predecessor of the CBI, and he also sponsored Shackleton's expedition to the Antarctic. So he covered quite a lot of territory, this gentleman. But he had a big influence in one particular way. One of the traction manufacturers we mentioned earlier, British Westinghouse Electrical, was kind of floundering a bit in the Great War years. This gentleman organised the convergence of that firm and Vickers, what we call today a defence manufacturing firm, also kind of floundering, looking to find a toehold in the post-war world. He facilitated the convergence of those two firms into a firm that would become Metropolitan Vickers. This gentleman also managed to sell his company, or his interest in Metropolitan Amalgamated, to Metropolitan Vickers, the new conglomerate, for somewhere around 13 to 14 million pounds in 1919. So that's not bad going. And that also laid the foundations for a loco contract to come about. So we have a plan, and here's the approach. Oh, first of all the correspondences and the terminology, the budget is using the word reconstruction. We've got concepts coming together for the locomotive reconstructions in 1919 and the contract with Metropolitan Vickers in September 1919. Now the former British Westinghouse organisation, now Met Vickers, supplies the new traction kit. And the Vickers Gun Mounting Department, based at Barrow Furnace, become the designers for the reconstruction. They design the bogies, and they work on how we reuse and manufacture the parts and assemble the locomotives. So they have the mechanical end of the job. Now here's the thing. no government money. The Met's not a rich railway, but the Metropolitan gets an assurance that Metropolitan Vickers will support the funding for their locomotive reconstruction if the Met Railway spends £1 million on projects with Metropolitan Vickers. And from my previous slide, you'll notice there's a lot of going on, particularly power supply generation stuff, very expensive stuff. And Mr. Docker, in whatever capacity, not strictly in official capacity, gave that assurance. It's down in his, if you like, biography. He gave that assurance in late 1919. So that was the key to stepping forward. And that funding, just touching on another little specific feature here, the Lloyd's bond was used as one of those financial instruments to just oil the wheels. The Lloyd's bond was invented not by an insurance company or bank, but by a gentleman called John Horatio Lloyd in Victorian times. They'd realised that no railway company has money to start with after it's paid for the parliamentary stuff. Can't afford anything. So what they do is issue a Lloyd's bond to say, here's my bond, I will pay you, Mr. Contractor, in maybe 5 years' time, when I've got some money. And the contractor can take that bond away and cash it immediately if they so choose. So it's a kind of everyone wins thing. But it's a mechanism that was used a lot. And the Metropolitan used it, for example, for the major works they were doing at Kilburn. And just a side thought from me, this is my perspective and hindsight, that we're nicely set up for a fairly standard project model where you go in with optimism, then you discover stuff, and then you panic, and then you do something to recover it. And I think those that have been in the projects and as the ins and outs of the organisation will recognise that project model. It comes up time and again, no matter how many times you try and find ways around it. A lot of words there. It's not the way to do a presentation slide, I admit. On the left is how they plan to start the Loco project. And on the right is how it turned out. And I've highlighted the key points. What they were trying to do with this project was turn two different locomotives into one new design. And they envisaged that it could be done, the whole lot, in 23 months at a cost of 213,000. Traction was fixed price, nice and straightforward. The Vickers mechanical work was cost plus. Danger signs already. The as it turned out bit, so they got their first trial reconstruction 21 months after contract. That took a bit longer than expected. And they had some design changes to cope with and some cost stuff. And even when the Loco got delivered, I think a few people were a little bit unhappy and demanded changes. What we did get, following on from that, is 4 reconstructions of the Camelback locos, pretty much as conceived. Pretty much as conceived. Because those Camelback reconstructions were virtually new locomotives. They reused 1 or 2 bits, soul bars, cross members, and a lot of small parts. For example, pipe joints, and if you know a window drop light, those little brass finger lifts that they even recovered those. They saved every little bit they could. So 1 BTH reconstruction, 4 British Westinghouse reconstructions, and then following on from that, after a bit of negotiation and price dealing, they got a fixed price for the whole lot and 15 new build locomotives. Overall, 43 months it took as a project, and the final bill was 312k. And that's the job in a nutshell. Just mentioned the action at Vickers. Top left, the blue door. Behind the blue door is the gun shop. The railway tracks in the foreground are crossing a fairly busy road today, Michelson Road. And behind the camera is the workshop where the reconstruction work should have happened, what's called the howitzer shop. And most of the Loco basic engineering, when it was going to be the reconstruction, even the new Locos, the underframes and the basic structure was put together in the howitzer shop. The gun shop, and we see the 2 pictures down below, two bays, 13 over there and to the right, bay 12, where the locomotives, certainly the new locomotives, are brought across and laid out to be finished, panelling finished off, bits attached, and so on, and to be lowered onto their bogies. Those pictures are somewhere around February 1922 at the lower part. The picture at the top right is probably early 1920. What am I thinking of? Yeah. Early 1922, maybe late 1921. And you can just about see small figures on the locomotives actually doing work and the end panels marked out for the headlights. Again, bringing in the people dimension to this, the gun mounting drawing office did the design. I think they did a good job for what they had to work with. There are 12 names on the drawing register associated with the couple of hundred contract drawings there. And over 40% of the drawings of those 200 were produced by two people, Mr. Scantlebury and Mr. Chadwick. And on balance, I think that, as I say, they did a good job given what they were provided with. But the two bottom loco photographs are quite famous ones. The track you see across the bottom of the right-hand photograph is the track that finds its way out through the Blue Door to Michelson Road and the Howitzer Shop. And that was the way in for the locomotives to there, and it was the way out again. There was no exit the other way. The track radii were too tight. There, the first product, Loco 17, spring 1921-ish. The houses in the background are still there in modern times. The yard's been swept away a bit. The loco's probably been sent round. It's had a long, tortuous journey from the workshops to get there. And just behind it are the buildings which contain the site main electricity supply. So it's probably there for some kind of electrical testing. Loco's not complete. There's certainly no traction motors in there, but it's kind of close to going there. And it's maybe not a question to stop now, but maybe there's just something on that loco that isn't even on the drawing, but it's quite a nice little touch. A couple of other pictures. Probably better go in chronological order. The bottom one here, Neasden. We've got a train lined up there, Loco 17 on the front, 7 coaches behind it. This is autumn 1921. You can see there's been some mods on that loco. It's now got a side lookout for the drivers on the driver's side, but some of the other mods haven't happened. I have a feeling that might have been a test train because it's about the time when they started to have a few concerns about the ability of trains to stop at speed when tripped. The braking distances were rather long and they had to go and hunt some better ways to do it. Top picture came from the London North Western Railway Society. We're talking about the delivery of the trains. Mid-1922, near Rugby. A coloured image in modern times, but quite a nice survival to get that picture. Just to complete the loco bit, Loco 21, the Northern City, was one of the original camelbacks and was fitted together and survived for a bit longer. But 20 locomotives, including number 7, a Reconstruction, all delivered by spring 1923, concerns with the painting, and Vickers paid for some of that, and continuing issues with the electrics. But the locos gradually built their reliability to the extent that they were up and running for, in 1925, firstly, the electrification to Rickmansworth, but also some big things in 1925. Loco 15 spent some time, bottom left, in Wembley Exhibition, showing off its innards. And in June 1925, we had Loco 4, having a derailment and collision at Baker Street. From the accident reporting, looks like driver and crew error, overspeed, tripping past a red signal. So not a happy story for that loco, and it wrote off one coach and a W-stop train for a while. But down bottom right is a picture I haven't got to the bottom of. Watford Extension, which opened on 30th November 1925, and we have Loco 12 there on a special train. I don't know whether that is the opening train. I have a feeling it isn't, and it might be on some kind of special working for another purpose, but Loco 12 involved. Quick rattle through the naming. you'll no doubt have some sense of the locos being named from 1927. Quality bronze plate, £5, 3 shillings each, 2 of those each loco. The fitting costs £3, 10 shillings. But these are nameplates that got whipped off in the 1940s or thereabouts and replaced with an aluminium alloy version in the 1950s. By the time we get to the 1930s, don't forget, I've already hinted, we've got a fairly stable service. The locos are living a quiet life. There's no big spotlight there. They're just doing their job. London Transport inherits things you see. By about 1935, they're starting to relivery the locomotives, except I can tell you that the livery of the locomotive that they came up with was based on the original Metropolitan livery. I know because the LT livery drawing is a tracing over the Met drawing. It's exactly the same, apart from the London Transport characters and so on. So, plus ça change, as they might say. Engineering changed. LT had its strings on the engineering side of things, had its control on the engineering side of things. Acton took over the major overhauls as Needham became a running depot. So that kind of brought in some different approaches to the engineering. And the crewing changed. They moved away from 2 crews per loco to a rather more conventional roster. The locos continued to do their work for Vine Street, moved the Northern City stock, carried on that till 1939, Chiltern Coal sidings you will have heard of, and various other activities for works trains. One loco found itself at the East Ham, maybe covered the district trains to Southend. We don't think they did. But by the late 1930s, the locos are in line in the new works programme to go. They were no longer needed if they brought in a complete set of Metropolitan compartment stock multiple unit trains. As it happened, that extended electrification didn't happen before the war, but the Southern and the London North Eastern Railway weren't interested anyway. A brief mention of wartime. One of the things that happened in wartime is the Great Western City service ended, so locos had a bit more free time, and the loco drivers roster went down from 22 on a Saturday's accepted service to 16. So quite a drop in the demand for resource there. But also, you see Loco 3, I think it is there, on a train of tanks that have been worked on Acton Works during the war. So locos did a few useful things as well as keeping the basic service running. The locos acquired a new livery during the war, but the wars marked the time when the locos started to have a few prangs. Major collision with Loco 19 in 45 and some depot damage. All those locos didn't see service thereafter. So we get to the 1950s, re-emerging from maintenance and overhaul. Up at the top right there, Loco 12. I'm having good authority that Loco 12 was the last standard major overhaul through Acton in May 1959. The electric working got to Chesham, the locos found their way up to Chesham, but meanwhile the changeovers at Rickmansworth to the Aylesbury trains carried on. And we got the last day of loco service, 9th September 1961. There was a special train, that was Loco 18, but Loco 16 was the last one back into the yard right at the end of the traffic day. And after September 1961, 8 locos straight out and withdrawn, but the traction motors were kind of handy for BR. 4 locos went to BR as well for possible test use. Didn't actually happen, scrapped in 66. And 4 locos went to service stock fleet. Loco 3 lasted until 65 at Ruislip, but the ones we most know, 12, 1 and 5, got to Ealing, Neath and Acton and did some good work for a number of years thereafter. We've now got Loco 12 there. 12 found a niche. Late 1960s, early 1970s, brake block testing became the reason that 12 survived like it did. But it also got to do some other work, for example, on the leaf clearing experiments. That's leaf clearing train at Amersham, developing a technique that became quite useful on that stretch of railway, is now used in very, very different ways. Bottom left is one that doesn't often get mentioned. Arrestor tests for trains at dead-end sidings. 38 stop unit accelerated towards the buffer stops by Loco 12 and released at just a safe moment. So development work also got done with Sarah. Sarah did spend a lot of time actually as a baby of the engineers vehicles fleet and new brake controls to test out kit that would be used on the battery locos. Did brake testing for new wagons. Again, the thing that's not often mentioned is that every now and again engineers' trains sit down and get put away in a siding in an inconvenient place. And Sarah's job for a small number of times in the 80s and early 90s was to go out to those remote locations and bring the train back. Sarah had the oomph and the acceleration to get the train out of the way in amongst the commuter service. So a little claim to fame there as a recovery loco. And then the heritage business. Well, there have already been some tours with the locos in the 1950s, early 1960s, and the centenary tour in 63. Pivotal moment, locos 5 and 12 on the breakdown tour in 1972. We've got to give tons of credit here to Jeff Thorne and his colleagues for making that happen, having the vision to see that happen and come together. And we see the picture down there, bottom left. The breakdown van tours kind of opened the minds to possibilities. Now by the 1980s, we're looking at BR stock and Sarah hauling that around the metropolitan territory. A lot more showing the flag took place from Shildon in 75. Depot open day. Brighton is a noteworthy trip because that's when the slipping tyres on the wheels started to get noticed. And the Chart-Leakin trip in 1992, I think, was the only outing Sarah had on its roller bearings, on power, on the main line, and allowed to haul. And apparently, from somebody who did log the trip, it had quite a tidy turn of speed coming back. Depot visits, of course, loco haul, but some rail tours, the Mary Rose to Portsmouth Harbour, down to Folkestone, Dover, and some trips up and down at Hampton Court. All part of showing the flag, getting Sarah out and about, and putting herself on the map. This is just to mention, behind those tours, you have to position the loco, you have to get ready. These couple of moves from before and after one of those tours. And again, the people dimension. We got nicely set up in the top left in the battery loco cab. We got Frank Evans and Peter Boys. I think it's also John Curd on the handles. All good characters. Just an acknowledgement just how many people and test crews and so on had to get together to make things happen. And the heritage activity continues. We've got the Steam on the Met events that have gone on over the years, ever changing. The big celebrations for something like Uxbridge and the Met 150, H&C and District, all with Sarah playing a part and keeping the fleet going, if you like. So this is my moment to say, Graham, your bit.
Okay, can you hear me? Good. Okay, so I'm just going to load up the presentation and get this working. This is the one. Sorry, the technology is defeating me here. Let's just finish this one. Right. Get there. Right, here we go. Okay, so my role today is to tell you what's happening with Sarah Siddons now. As Charles has quite aptly given you all the history, what I'm going to do now is tell you what's happened to Sarah in the last few years, what we've had to do to her to keep her in service and regularised with the Rail Inspectorate, and what's happening with her at this moment in time. So I'm going to use this. So you would have seen lots of photos like this now, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background to explain what's happened in the last year or two, some of the safety modifications we've had to put in place, then what happened up till the time when the pandemic took over, and then what happened afterwards, and what the future plans are. So it's a bit wordy, this one, but Sarah Siddons, after Steam on the Met and various maintenance activities around 2006, the loco was brought back into use to enhance Metronet's image in terms of heritage. And as a result, she was repainted. You'll see some photographs in a minute. Again, but she was repainted back into the Metropolitan livery by the museum with 1930s style nameplates. In 2012, she went off to Eastleigh to have vacuum brake equipment fitted so that she would be both vacuum and air braked, and off to the National Rail Museum for Railfest. That was very successful. She came back she came back after that, and in 2014, the Rail Inspectorate started taking a little bit of interest because I think a number of them had been out and seen Sarah operating in service and seeing people riding in the locomotive. Most of the support crew, myself included, used to ride in the locomotive when we were supporting the heritage activities, and they got a bit nervous about all the electrical equipment inside her, and especially with the ability that you could potentially touch some live equipment if you were a bit silly. And they said it didn't comply with the electricity work regulations, which, strictly speaking, it didn't, of course. So I'll show you some photographs of what we did to bring ourselves back into compliance. And in 2018, she went off to Arlington Fleet Services down at Eastleigh for a heavy overhaul and a repaint. She did come back in 2019 to do the District Line 150, but we'd already identified there were some issues with her axles. They were quite badly worn and in need of replacement. But we did bring her out in 2019 just to do the District Line 150 and then take her back again. So she wasn't repainted at that moment in time. She was allowed to run on a special concession for that District Line 150 event. And in the meantime, Arlington Fleet Services procured the 4 new axles, which are now sitting at Arlington. So before the 2008 repaint job, she looked a bit, she was in need of a bit of tender, loving care. So this is what she looked like. After the repaint, she looked like that. A very, very much improved version of Sarah, looking very nice and very, very smart. So that was what the repaint did, and Metronet took all the kudos for that. And I remember going out on the run when I think it was a silver key was given to the managing director of from the managing director of Metronet over to London Underground to effectively pass her back into London Underground ownership, although she really was already part of London Underground's stock. These are the electric modifications, and I'm going to show you, if I can, on this. You will see here some plastic covers, and there's plastic covers down here as well. These plastic covers are over the electrical bits where, if you were silly, you could poke your hand in and get yourself fairly badly electrocuted or a bad electric shock. There's also grills been put over the resistors so they can still breathe, but at the same time, you can't put your hands in there. All this modification was done by the London Underground test train engineers who manufactured all the parts and then fitted them, and they're still in use now. And you can see also at this end, one of the big line contactors, they put a cover over it and the chute at the bottom it used to throw out the odd spark every now and again, and you didn't stand next to that when she was operating in service. But with the cover over the top, those sparks, if they happen, are now directed down to the floor, so far less dangerous than they used to be. So that was the electrical mods, and the rail inspectorate came along, saw them all and said, that's much, much better. We're quite happy now that you're maintaining even though she's a heritage train, to a standard which is electrically acceptable. Then COVID came along, of course. So in November 2019, the Loco went back to Arlington Fleet Services to have her worn axles replaced and to have a new repaint job. The quote to replace the axles arrived just before the COVID pandemic hit the UK, and as a result, basically all the work stopped. London Underground had the budget at the time to do all the work, and in fact we'd already paid for the repainting work, so that was paid for. And we'd received a quote for the axles, and we're quite happy to pay for it all to be done. But of course, COVID stopped all of that. So she sat in Arlington, undercover, luckily, for almost 2.5, well, it was 2 years, because it was November 2021 that I went back to visit Sarah at Arlington, and we kicked off the process of getting all the work started again. So, sorry, it's 2022, so it was 3 years. So we contacted Arlington, and we asked them to re-quote. We felt it was fair that we shouldn't try and hold them to the original quote 3 years later. So they re-quoted, but they kept the price fairly reasonable. It was an increase, but that was because inflation means there's always an increase. The revised quote for the axle replacement was received in September 2022 for the sum of 76,000. It was about 60k before, just over 63. And that was an increase of around 16%. And London Underground, we had a big meeting between the museum and London Underground and the managing director, one Andy Lord, and we agreed that we would, London Underground would pay for this work to be continued. So a 100k budget figure was agreed, and Arlington Fleet Services were issued the purchase order after quite some issues with our procurement people over single sourcing. We did explain to them that as the vehicle was already at Arlington, the additional cost of moving it somewhere else would probably outweigh any additional savings they might make by going to somebody else. But we had to prove all that, and the paperwork had to demonstrate that. But we got there in the end. And the work commenced in December 2022. And this is what Sarah looks like when she was in the paint shop. A few of us went down there and took these photographs. These are all my photographs. But she, again, the slightly reddish colour is because she's under sodium light, so it's a bit more maroon when you take her out into daylight. But she's looking very, very smart again, and ready for the additional work that needs to be done to replace her axles. All of the, even the nameplate has all been repainted. The decals have all been copied and meticulously copied and then reinstalled over the new paint system, because you couldn't get the decals, you couldn't go and purchase them, so they had to photograph them and reprint them. So they're actually copies via photograph, but they Arlington do a splendid job to bring it back to a lovely looking condition. And to be honest, some of their guys in their paint shop were just going over and looking for any tiny little scratch and dabbing a bit of red paint on. They really took ownership. They loved Sarah, and they thought it was brilliant to have a vehicle like Sarah in their paint shop. So they're very proud of the output that we got at the end of the day. So so axles. I mentioned she went there originally to have her axles replaced, and they were purchased, and they were sitting on the shop floor at Arlington for nearly 2 years. So in January 2023, following the repaint, she was lifted off of her bogies, placed on stands, ready for her bogies to be removed and her axle replacement work to commence. Arlington started the process of removing wheel pans from the first axle, and unfortunately, on examination of the first axle and the removal of the wheel, they found significant scoring on the hole left by the wheel when the axle was removed. It was so bad that it would have failed the mainline standard, so it couldn't put the wheels back on again. And we try and always keep Sarah not just up to the standards that London Underground require, but we try and keep it compliant with the mainline standards because, as you saw from some of Charles's slides, she does often go on little trips up and down the country, and we want that availability to still be there. So they couldn't fit the old wheels back onto the new axles. Now, they haven't removed all the wheels yet, but if the first wheels are an indication of what the other ones are like, we knew that we were in trouble, we needed some new wheels. So this is the scoring you can see on the inside of the wheels, and I'll just point it out there. All of these vertical lines in there are score marks. And this is the axle it's taken off, and you can see score marks there as well. All this was probably done when the wheels were refitted the last time it had new axles or new wheels fitted. It had been like that quite a long time. But as Charles also said earlier, we did notice that the wheels were starting to move on their axles back in 2019, 2018. So it did need them to be removed. You can see they're quite severe on some of these axles, and you get the same effect on the inside of the wheel. So work was temporarily stopped, and we needed to find some new wheels. So as a result of this first axle, we haven't taken the wheels off the other ones yet. There may be one or two that are still usable, but we said to ourselves, what we really want, the brand new wheels. We've got brand new axles, let's see what we can find. Speaking to Arlington, we asked them for a quote. They said, we'll talk to our wheel manufacturers and see what they say. Unfortunately, their minimum order quantity is 40 wheels, and we only need 8, and we don't really want 32 spares. So, and they're very expensive. They're about £2,000 a piece for each wheel blank, and that's quite a lot of money. London Underground, who owned Sarah, said that's a bit steep. What can we do? So we started to look very closely at the wheels and the drawings for the wheels, and we then quite quickly, with working with Arlington, determined that the same type wheel was used on some coal wagons called MAA wagons and some MHA wagons as well. So a call to arms went out to the industry, some very, very high people, including Peter Handy and others in the main line, saying, has anybody got any wheels that might fit our Sarah Siddons? And this took a few months for the word to get around, but I remember bumping into various people I'd met in the main line over my years as the chief rolling stock engineer, who were saying, I hear you're looking for wheels for your Sarah Siddons. Yes, have you got any, please? We haven't, unfortunately. We might know somebody who has. And the word got around very, very quickly, and it was determined that there are some of these wagons being scrapped soon. The good thing about that is if the wheels are a reasonable size and got a reasonable amount of wear on them, the axles on the wagons are at a narrower diameter than the axles on Sarah. So theoretically, if we get the wheels off the axles, we can bore them out to the right diameter and we can fit them. So we're still currently looking for these spare wheels. Hot off the press this week is we think we may have found some spare blanks, which means they're brand new wheels. We're not confirmed that yet. The company that said they've got them says on their computer, it says they're there, but they need to go and actually check. So we are still not counting our chickens before we get there. So we're searching for the wheels. If we found them and we can then negotiate a reasonable price for them, hopefully they might want to scrap them for £1 each. You know, you never know. Then things might actually go ahead a lot quicker, but we're not really banking on that at this moment because we've had a few false starts already on this one. So what about the future for Sarah then? Once she's repaired, we're still hopeful that we can get the compatible wheels from the mainline wagon user. If we can, and they're good enough and they're good condition, Arlington can fit them in 4 to 6 weeks, and that's quite a rapid turnaround for them. But just to be prudent, we are adjusting our heritage train operations plan for this year. We're based on the assumption that Sarah will only be available for the September run. the Amersham Heritage Day, which is on the 10th of September. But if we can get her in place and we can test her and we can get her recertified in time, we will run her on the 9th and the 10th of September. You may, if we can get the wheel sets fitted and we get her back to London, you may even see her out on test runs, on proving runs before that. But that's our plan. If we can't do that, we'll run the 38 tube stock at Amersham like we did last September. So we've got backup plans. Hopefully everything will go well and we'll be running both Sarah and the 38 tube stock at Amersham in September. And that's my update, folks. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and it's giving you the latest information hot off the press this week. We might be lucky, we're just not sure yet. Anybody got any questions for myself or Charles? Must be somebody's got a question. Go on, thank you.
I found it very interesting. Can one of you say a bit about the actual ownership of Locomotive? I wasn't clear whether it's the museum now owns it or whether it's still London Underground. London
Underground owns Sarah Siddons, and London Underground owns the 4TC Mark 1s as well. And although I didn't say it there, they've been quite extensively modified over the last year or two. They've had controlled emission toilets fitted. They've got central door locking, which many of the Mark 1s in the country still haven't got. And when a lot of the window bars were removed on the main line, Mark 1s, we didn't remove ours. So that makes ours at the moment, our 4TC set, the most compliant Mark 1s in the country, we believe. So they were recently loaned to Swanage for one of their events, their gala days, and they came back to London just a little while ago. The big problem we've got with the 4TC set at the moment is their mainline ticket has expired. It's a bit of an oversight by our London Underground colleagues, but not significantly so. The paperwork's gone in. There's a meeting with the ORR this week to see if we can accelerate the process. But it's the usual thing where whenever they renew a different rolling stock certificate, they have to consult with all the other railways that might be affected. And since theoretically the Mark 1s can go anywhere in the country, there's a lot of consultation. So we have to go through the process, unfortunately. But the ORR are trying to speed that up for us and minimise it as much as possible. So it is London Underground owned, so is the 4TC set. The 38 tube stock is owned by the museum. And the Q stock, of course. Any other questions? Yes, one more, thank you. And one at the back as well.
I was just wondering where, I think it was Charles, if I've got the name right, spoke about a mural, and I was a Metroland, welcome to Metroland. Where is that, please?
It's near Rayners Lane Station.
Oh, right.
It's not actually facing the railway. It's a local council initiative as far as I can tell. And it's on the side wall of a slightly run-down building on the main road. So you have to toddle out of Rayners Lane Station and head slightly towards North Harrow, and you can see it from there.
Thank you very much. Well, the clue actually was there, wasn't it?
Oh,
ORL
yes.
on the front.
Yeah.
I didn't crack the code. Thank you very much.
Is it not visible from the railway?
Not visible from the railway.
Ah, that's a shame. So I think we've got a question at the back.
What's the status of the LMR inspection saloon? Florence Nightingale, is it, or something?
Yes. Florence Nightingale's had a lot of work done by Eastleigh again and was brought back to effectively operating condition. She was delivered back to Ruislip. Unfortunately, when they connected her up to the 4TC set, the central door locking malfunctioned. So Eastleigh recognise it's their problem. They've designed both systems for the 4TC and for the Director's Saloon, and they know they've got to come and fix it, and we just haven't agreed a date yet at the moment for them to do it. I would like, if Sarah Siddons is available for the Heritage Day Amersham in September, one of the options I'm considering is getting the Director's Saloon in the consist. We can't put passengers on it while it's moving, unfortunately, because it hasn't actually got any seats that are bolted down. But it is a really, really nice vehicle inside, and we think that it would be quite a useful thing for the museum to have some internal displays and things that people can go on board at the lunch break and have a look around it and see some of the work the museum do. So we use it as a bit of a marketing vehicle. We are talking with the current chief rolling stock engineer of the Underground, my successor, to see what we can do to see if we can get passengers allowed to operate on it. But it will mean some very creative engineering that allows us to fix seats on it that could be taken out if we need them to be. But it's not dead. It's not, it's not disappeared. It will be in use, and I'd like to see it in the train with a bit of luck at the Amersham weekend. If not, certainly next year. And it's been through a pretty nice refurbishment as well. It looks really good. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Anybody else? Got one more down here. Do you want to make this
Thank
last
you.
one?
I was pleased to see the date, because I was wondering when I pulled off for the train. It was the 7th of July 1984, the Portsmouth run. I was a signalman at Warren and pulled off for that train on Saturday evening as it went back up towards London direction. But what I'd like to know is how are you going to fit all this new signalling equipment if you're going to allow it on National Rail? I take it that will be one of your plans.
When it's used on National Rail, it either has to have a locomotive with the signalling equipment on the same train, probably hauling it.
Okay.
And it's the same problem we've got on London Underground as well. As they re-signal the Underground, it becomes incompatible with the trip-cop system that's fitted on Sarah at the moment. So we either have to have a different vehicle with the signalling equipment on it, and we make sure that it still obeys the signalling system, the whole train.
Will that vehicle be a locomotive or coach?
If it's on the main line, I'm not sure. If it's on London Underground, it's almost certainly going to be a locomotive, probably a battery loco to take it to site. But there are still places on the Underground after the signalling's completed where we can run Sarah. So Amersham to Watford still going to have trip cops operational.
On National Rail, could you use an EDL?
Now you're talking about trains I don't know anything about, so forgive me. We will obviously have to use something that's compatible because the law says you have to have a compatible signalling system. Yeah. I think we'll have to make this the last one, is that right?
Could I just ask, did we ever have to upgrade this for high voltage, or was it always happy with 750 volts when we ran it on the Southern?
It was always compatible with 750 volts. There was some additional resistors put in just to make sure that we stayed comfortably within the tolerances on one or two bits of items, for instance, the compressor. So the compressor starter resistor was boosted a bit. So there had been a little bit of work done. I didn't mention that because it's small beer compared to all the rest of the mods, but yeah, there was some work done to make sure it was compatible. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone. I think we've actually finished the season, as I said earlier, on a very high note. So can we give a big round of thanks to both Charles and Graham for excellent presentations. Well, as I said earlier, it only remains for me now to wish you all a very happy summer break and hopefully see you all back here on the 11th of September. Just one last thing, if I could ask you to leave promptly tonight, as down here is about to be fumigated. So if you don't wish to breathe in a few chemicals you'd rather not, can you please leave as quickly as you can? Thank you very much.